Good morning. It's 10 o'clock, and it's time for us to have a green tea chat. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. We are a foreign policy think tank in Washington, D.C., nonpartisan, non-advocacy, as we were created by Congress as a memorial to good old Woodrow Wilson. I'm the director at the China Environment Forum. I've been at the Wilson Center for 25 years, and a lot of that has been digging into U.S.-China cooperation and competition around climate, clean energy, but we've done a host of other kinds of projects looking at water, NGO capacity building. And our newest project is called China Jet. And that's short for China's role in the just energy transition in the global south. And as part of this new project, I invited Ernest Scheyder to join me for a green tea chat to talk about his book. And here's the promo moment here, Ernest. The War Below. That if you can see it, lithium, copper, and the global battle to power our lives. And hold it up for one more second so you make sure you noted, everyone. The book dives into tensions around, includes tensions about China's dominance in the critical mineral supply space, but it's actually so much more and very heavily on the United States. I have a feeling, Ernest, that you wanted Americans to understand what's going on here, right? Um,
Indeed.
just the quick short bio is that Ernest is a senior correspondent for Reuters, where he's covered U.S. shale revolution, politics, and the environment. And I have to say, big congrats. Your book was longlisted for the 2024 National Book Award for Nonfiction and the Financial Times Schroeder's Business Book of the Year. Is this your first book?
It is, yes.
Okay, so you're like Shoni, going to hit a lot of home runs, steal a lot of bases, but you're still reporting on the topic. So
I am.
everything's,
Yep.
even though the book just came out, there's a lot to talk about. So now it has many stories that are talking about conflicts around critical minerals. But I was really struck at the beginning that both the prologue and then at the end, the epilogue, it was about a flower. So could you tell us, because I really think that was one of your anchor stories related to this flower. Can you tell us why did you bookend the book around a flower in Nevada?
Well, first off, it's great to be with you, Jennifer, and the Wilson Center. Thanks for your time. And I'm just so thrilled to be sharing The War Below with you and with your communities here. The War Below is a book really about critical minerals writ large, as you were saying, Jennifer. But at its core, it's a story about community and about choice. And what are the choices we're willing to make if we as citizens of the world want an energy transition? And there's no easy answers. There's a lot of trade-offs. So the story that you're referencing is about the Rhyolite Ridge lithium deposit in Nevada, roughly 200 miles north of Las Vegas. And there's a massive deposit of lithium there commingled with boron. So for those of us listening today that are in industry, anytime you're able to produce two products, hey, that's great. You have two sources of revenue. So you can see why it's drawn appeal from the mining industry, specifically a company called Ioneer. Now, unfortunately for the developers, this site, roughly 200 miles north of Las Vegas, is also home to a rare flower found nowhere else on the planet, known as Team's buckwheat. And therein lies the tension that I wanted to bring to the reader right from the beginning of this narrative here. What matters more, the lithium or this flower? Could the lithium mine be developed and the flower preserved? If there was nothing done to protect the flower, would it not go extinct due to climate change? These are all questions that I think people need to be asking themselves and thinking through. And I found the quandary or the tension between the flower and this lithium project so interesting. I made it the narrative spine of the book. So it's the longest part of The War Below at about 3 or 4 chapters. And you get to meet people on all sides of this. You get to meet the chairman of the company that'd like to develop it, who actually sees developing a lithium mine as his way of leaving the planet cleaner than the one that he found. And you also get to meet a conservationist who is adamant that biodiversity should not play second fiddle to the fight against climate change. And so therein lies the rub. And each chapter in the book, yes, looks at proposed projects, mostly, as Jennifer was saying, in the United States, because I wanted US audiences, especially, to have to grapple with this new reality. But it's about so much more than just specific projects. It goes into themes. I just mentioned biodiversity. There's also broad themes around Indigenous rights, religious rights, community engagement, and yes, geopolitics, given China's role in this space, a topic near and dear, I know, to Jennifer's heart. So this is the war below, but for me, it's that tension that I really wanted to center in the audience's mind and let them grapple with the stickiness and decide what they would do.
So choice was the main takeaway. And
Yes,
yeah,
yeah.
and thank you for saying the name of the flower because I didn't know how to pronounce it. I just read it countless times. So in your chapters, you've got books on mines, the lithium bake-off competition in Bolivia.
Yep.
You take us to a bankruptcy court in Delaware. And also you took me to the hardware aisle where the leaf blowers, I can't, I was going to buy an electric leaf blower to clean up my gutters because I'm short. I'm like, no, I don't know what to do. But you're not going to tell me what choice to make, right? And then you also have stuff about recycling and green tech. Which of these chapters that most intrigued or surprised you? I mean, we were talking a little bit about the recycling, but yeah, maybe it was your leaf. Did you buy the leaf blower?
Well, now we have to dive into the leaf
Yeah, we
blower
have to say
briefly.
leaf blower now.
So when I was writing this book, the number one response I would get from friends or family was, "Well, I don't own an electric vehicle, so I don't really know if that topic's going to affect me." And it was right around the time that I was writing the book that I became a homeowner and decided to go all in on electric lawn care, which I know sounds extremely boring, but I decided, hey, I got to be on brand since I'm writing this book. So I got an electric lawnmower and yes, an electric leaf blower. I had a very good friend at the time who I met up with at the time who was on a very strong campaign against two-stroke powered leaf blowers, two-stroke engine powered leaf blowers. And just in short, these are horrible for the environment. They emit a bunch of noxious fumes that exacerbate climate change. And so the answer, my friend said, is you got to get an electric leaf blower. So I did. But that, as I was writing the book, took me down this rabbit hole. Okay, if getting an electric powered leaf blower is better for the planet than one powered by a two-stroke engine, where do the critical minerals come from? I mean, did the lithium come from northern Chile? Did the copper come from Peru? Did the cobalt get taken out of the ground by a young child in the DRC? Et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I couldn't figure out where any of the critical minerals came from. And so for me, that reinforces this tension and this idea of choice. You know, if we had more regional production in the United States, or even if we had a more transparent critical mineral supply chain, would that not make the average consumer more comfortable when she or he buys, say, a leaf blower, a laptop, a television? So many more products out there than just electric vehicles that are increasingly powered by lithium ion batteries. So for me, like using this sort of whimsy and silly example of a leaf blower actually really crystallized the issue for the reader and helped make this common household appliance actually centered in this broad narrative. So that's why I did that. I don't know if that was my most intriguing or interesting chapter, but for me, I found it the best way to connect with the audience here on this broad theme.
And well, what about the I mean, and the thing too is that as you read this book, and just so you know, people, incredibly readable, accessible, a lot of stories, but so complex. The
Mm,
recycling question.
yes.
Can we
Yeah.
not recycle ourselves out of this problem?
Well, I will say right off the bat. So, in a previous life, I wrote about the oil and gas industry. I actually lived in North Dakota. I've lived and breathed the oil and gas industry. I know it very, very well. And I transitioned, pun intended, I suppose, to covering clean energy and the green energy transition professionally. And I did see a lot of similarities there. Obviously, there's a lot of big differences. One of the big differences is like when you burn off oil or natural gas in an internal combustion engine, it's gone forever, so you can't use it again. But lithium doesn't lose its ability to retain a charge just because it's been sitting in a battery for 20, 30, 40 years. Copper can be remade into wiring or pipes or other things again and again and again. So that ability to refashion that would be my dog joining me. So,
Okay, that's good.
um, the ability for critical minerals to be reused again and again and again is actually a huge part of the appeal. But one of the shall we say, main logistical challenges for recycling is actually collection. Transportation is a huge cost for the recycling, and so for the recycling chapter, I wanted to explore two companies, Li-Cycle and Redwood Materials, and look at their genesis and look at the different ways that they've each approached the recycling sector. So you get to meet the CEOs and founders of both companies in that chapters and see how those companies developed and where they are today. And then you also get to look at what are the key problems with recycling right now is there are just not enough recycling centers. And so
Mhm.
just think about it. I mean, by definition, and a really old battery, even if it might be drained, might have 1 or 2% of a charge in there. And then let's just say you've got a rail car filled with 1,000 old cell phone batteries, and each has 1%. that's a lot of charge. You just sort of add it all up. And so the potential exists, exactly. The potential exists for, maybe a spontaneous combustion or other incident. And indeed, sometimes that does happen over long rail distances. And so perhaps a way to get around this is to think about how do we locate more recycling facilities across the United States and really the world. But a recycling facility essentially is a chemical plant, and if people don't want more mines in their backyard, they probably don't want more chemical plants in their backyard. So this gets at the idea of choice and tension again. But I think it needs to be part of the broader conversation, Jennifer, because we have so many old electronics already that need to be recycled. I mean, I don't want to speak for you, but I can say that I have one or two old cell phones sitting, in a drawer in my kitchen that I need to
Me too.
take to the facility and to the recycling facility. And there's a lot of options out there. So for me, with this recycling chapter, it was bringing this idea to the reader that there is concrete action you can do. Yes, it's a complex supply chain, but there are ways around it. And I will just say, just as a minor anecdote, the infrastructure already exists for recycling in another sphere that everyone on this call knows about, but they just don't think about. If you've got an automobile powered by an internal combustion engine, it's got a lead acid battery. And what you
Mhm.
don't realize is that every single time that battery dies and you got to get a new one, there's a small fee attached to that purchase price. And what that small fee
Yes.
does is it pays for a whole ecosystem that you'll never see, you'll never visit. But what that does is it tears apart that old lead acid battery, completely recycles it, and makes sure that the component parts can be reused for new lead acid batteries. And that's just out of sight, out of mind because there's a
Mhm.
small charge tied into that. What would it look like to have a similar charge or structure set up for lithium ion battery
Mhm.
recycling in the United States? I think that's a conversation worth having.
Yeah, I mean, and I'm glad you said that because that's about policy, right? We have to have policies that are going to incentivize and support the sector. I mean, just as a little side note that we know, I mean, years ago when I started work in China, big issue was like the e-waste, the
Yes.
sorting
Yep.
facilities that we were shipping. This is why I have like three old computers in my basement too, because I don't know what, because I keep going to like Apple, like, how do I know where you're sending this? Like, mm. And so,
Yes.
and it caused a lot of pollution. So there was a lot of regulation. And China right now, I mean, they have, they started back in 2018, with 2014, a war on pollution, and 2018 really focused on the war on waste. So trying to promote recycling, waste reduction, and really, making sure that the e-waste is cleaned up. But China, they're also looking down at a lot of solar panels, even wind
Yes.
turbines. Where are they going to put this? Because their landfills are already full. But one thing that maybe we could just touch on is the issue of innovation. In
Mm,
China, in terms of the collection, one thing that a lot of car company, EV, electric vehicle companies in China, they unified their batteries. And instead of in the old
mm.
gas stations, because there's so many electric vehicles in China now, the streets of Beijing were quiet when I was there in June. It was freaky. But they have a battery station where you just drive on up and say, I want to drive 100 miles, and then take out your battery and they put in a one that's charged to 100 miles. And I think there's one place in California that's doing this, because that for me is also could be a game changer, because I don't have a driveway. I have nowhere to put the little charger port. So, I mean, there's hacks like this that I think that,
Yep.
calling out all entrepreneurs in America, you need to start thinking about, driving the clean energy revolution by, thinking at the back end of it for the recycling. All right. So because I'm the China Environment Forum, we got to talk a little bit about China. We've gotten some questions ahead of time that, talking about, the stranglehold of the Chinese on the critical mineral system, and, they're raising prices. What, you know, what would you like to say about that? Well, first of all, maybe start off with how did China come out on top with this? You have a whole chapter that I kind of sobbed a bit as I read it. Tell us about
Yeah,
that.
so I think the chapter you're referring to is about Mountain Pass. Yes, so a real quick primer: Mountain Pass is the only U.S. mine for rare earths, and rare earths are a grouping of 17 minor metals on the periodic table of elements that are used in various pieces of electronics out there. The most common are neodymium and praseodymium. Don't worry, there won't be a test at the end, but the best thing to remember here is those two NDPR, those the short and chemical terms for those, are used to make magnets that help turn power into motion. So electric vehicles don't have motors, but they have giant magnets that take power from a battery and turn it into motion. The thing that vibrates your cell phone when it vibrates in your pocket is a rare earth magnet. The United States basically helped invent the modern rare earths industry in the years after World War II, thanks to this Mountain Pass facility. And the chapter in the book that Jennifer's referring to goes through the history of that project. It also looks at the slow atrophy in the 1960s and 1970s of US government funding for rare earths research, and the increasing funding of biofuels and other types of green energy research at universities and federal labs and elsewhere across the country. And at that same time, China, as its economy was growing, began to realize that it had a lot of rare earth deposits within its own borders. And so it decided to invest heavily in this space. And it recognized, and I have this great quote in the chapter, that basically China has rare earths just like Saudi Arabia has oil. And that's from a former Chinese leader in that chapter.
That's
So just
Deng
as the United
Xiaoping.
Yes, yes. So just as the United States was paying less attention to rare earths and critical minerals, China was realizing that this is where the global economy was going and began investing heavily not only in industry but also in university and person power in this space. And so, right where we are today in 2024, China churns out hundreds of mining engineers every year. The United States only has about 12 or 13 accredited mining engineering schools. And the reality is that mining is just not considered an in demand career for many young people, 17 or 18, deciding what to study in university right now. So it's the exact opposite in China. So given all that, I mean, China has huge knowledge power in rare earths extraction and processing, and not just rare earths, but critical minerals in general. I mean, China also refines and processes most of the world's lithium, partly because, as Jennifer was alluding to, it's the world's largest EV market. So if you've got the biggest customers there, it makes sense to have the production and processing of their supply chain products there in China as well. It's also had got huge investments across the world in nickel and cobalt, not just in within its borders, but in places like Indonesia, the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Argentina, and elsewhere. And so China has begun to realize that whoever controls the production of lithium, copper, cobalt, nickel, and other critical minerals will control the 21st century economy the way that control of petroleum products defined the 20th century economy. And this is one of the big geopolitical tensions that I explore in the book. And what are the ways that the United States and other Western nations can or should address this? What does it look like to have a completely independent supply chain for critical minerals? Is that even possible? Can cooperation happen between two countries or two regions of the world with diametrically opposite approaches to the green energy transition? Should these or could these be used as economic weapons? I think the answer to that question is in some cases, yes. And we only need to look back the past 6 to 12 months that China has limited exports of germanium and gallium and graphite and rare earth processing technology um, on purpose. And it has in the past limited exports of rare earths in general. In 2010, it did this to Japan. And of course, one of the world's largest automakers is Japanese Toyota. And so this did not go unnoticed in the halls of Toyota there. So the reality is that the prowess of China in this space, controlling in some cases more than 80% of the production and processing of critical minerals, does cause some concern in some places in Washington and Brussels and elsewhere. So, how we respond to that, I think, is one of the defining questions that we need to be thinking through.
And you don't want to come out on either side. You're giving us the choices, right?
Right.
Well, one thing that I've been reading a lot of articles on this. Your book spurred me to want to know more. That the question a lot of times in the U.S. and Europe is that this is a national security issue, but there have been some good articles going into more the nuance that's like, well, not every material is national security. I mean, what's your thought on this national security kind of blanket?
Yeah, I will say that copper actually is one of the most, shall I say, contested materials as to whether or not it involves a national security issue. It's in the subtitle of my book, and for good reason. It's used across our global economy. I mean, the wires that connect the microphones which we're talking to right now, just as one example, are made of copper. But many countries and governments across the world, including the United States, do not consider it a critical mineral. Now, there's a whole host of definitions as to what exactly constitutes something that's critical. We know, obviously, we can't have electronics without copper, but it is produced in enough spaces in the world and processed in enough spaces in the world, and the market has such liquidity that any one actor would have an extremely hard time cornering the market. Now that differs greatly from, say, lithium, which up until about 10 or 15 years ago was a very niche metal used in like greases or pharmacologics and not really used en masse on scale. And we've seen demand just explode the past
Hmm.
decade, and it will continue to grow the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And so, what we historically you only had a few small countries, a few small producers in those countries extracting it. And then, as I was saying earlier, China has sort of cornered the processing of
Hmm.
much of the lithium right now. So two sort of different approaches there. Lithium is considered a critical mineral, and as that's why you can see that when people talk about national security and they talk about the economic health, let's just say the United States in this example, there are efforts to increase not only domestic production and processing, but also partner with ally nations as well. So the Inflation Reduction Act is a great example of this. Obviously tries to spur domestic mining and processing, but also rely on ally nations, countries with US free trade deals. Australia and Chile do have US free trade deals, and they
Hmm.
also are the world's largest lithium producers, as well as really large producers of nickel and copper and other critical minerals. So, from the IRA's perspective, having the IRA, having that piece of legislation work with ally nations across the world could take steps to abrogate the reliance on China. There are some people that point out that the US does not have free trade deals with any country on the African continent except for Morocco. And
Hmm.
so, if you're trying to expand there as well, could that be an issue? But we could talk all afternoon about that.
Yeah.
But the IRA is seen as a key part of this national security question.
Yeah. And so, well, maybe to go back to your initial flower story. So, because when you finished the book, it was unclear, what's happened with that lithium. That could be the largest lithium mine in the United States. Could it
It will
solve
be
our
one of them.
problems?
Yes. Yes.
Could it solve our problem?
So it will go a long way if and when it's built in order to solve the U.S. need for critical minerals. Ford has already decided to buy lithium from that project, and you get to see over the course of the book why Ford made that decision and how it
Hmm.
came to terms with the flower conundrum. So that is a key part of the narrative there. There's also another proposed project that I talk about in the book, the Thacker Pass Lithium Project in the
Hmm.
northern part of Nevada on the Oregon border that General Motors is helping develop. And I actually camp out at the site with a gentleman who
Yeah.
is opposed to all industrialization, actually advocates for de-industrialization. And I had a fascinating time with him while reporting out the book and got to see the site through his eyes. And I should say, just as a minor aside, that I wanted to include his perspectives on purpose because oftentimes the rejoinder from many in the mining industry that say, okay, well, if you don't want this mine, you just want to get rid of everything and go back to living in a cave. And his answer would be yes. This is a gentleman who grows his own food, forages for herbal medicines, and advocates for the best answer to the fight against climate change is to actually get rid of modern technology, to get rid of electricity, et cetera, et cetera. And this is not necessarily
Yeah.
a fringe idea anymore. And I'm not saying it's mainstream, but it is slowly gaining traction. I mean, this gentleman and his fight against his proposed mine ended up on the front page of the New York Times. He was written about in the New Yorker. And so for me, seeing the site through his eyes and experiencing his perspectives on this proposed project was really important to include in the narrative.
Yeah. I mean, there's a lot of different colors at that end of the spectrum. That there's,
Yes.
I mean, even though it's never very sexy, but energy efficiency.
Mm,
Questions like,
yes.
why are we investing in so many private vehicles? Why not more buses,
Mm,
electric buses and things that will give us more at scale and not, so that's also kind of being more efficient in how we want to build out the clean energy transition. So I appreciated
yes.
that you did make me think a lot about this. Okay, so back to China. Kind of, your further reporting on this. That you wrote an article recently for Reuters about Western mining companies pushing for higher price guarantees for green mining to help them
Yes.
compete with China. Can you explain that? Because it seems a little counterintuitive on the surface.
Sure. We were talking a little earlier about this market prowess that China has amassed the past 20 or 30 or 40 years. And so, economics 101, if you are controlling most of a production and processing of a product, you have a greater control over the price and the supply than your rivals do. And so, what we have seen in certain metals, especially nickel and cobalt, in the past 12 to 18 months, is that Chinese linked companies producing in Indonesia and in the Democratic Republic of the Congo specifically have been increasing their output of these two metals, nickel and cobalt, at levels that seem like they're actually operating at a loss. And they're still increasing production. And that seems to be a naked bid for market share. And so you have companies in Australia, the United States, and elsewhere that are trying to either maintain or increase their production of these critical minerals, and they're just not able to make a profit, or and basically it would operate at a loss. And we know that, say you're operating a mine in the United States, you're held at a much higher standard due to various federal and state regulations than in some cases mines are in the Democratic Republic of the Congo or elsewhere. And so that has a cost to it as well. And so what we're seeing is many of these miners are saying to Washington and other governments that there should be some support for some kind of two-tier of metal pricing. That
Hmm.
is maybe like a green nickel price and a standard nickel price. Now, I'm sure, have a billion questions right off the top of the bat. How could that work? What defines green nickel? Who would sell green nickel? Isn't the nickel one mine makes the same as a green nickel mine? And the answer to that last question is yes, indeed. They're both nickel in this example, but we were basically saying to a manufacturer, we want you to pay X% more for this nickel that is sustainably sourced. And if you are a manufacturer with a very thin profit margin, you can understand why they'd be loath to pay more for the
Hmm.
exact same product.
Okay.
But I think increasingly, if consumers realize that this product, whether it's an electric vehicle, a cell phone, a laptop, or other device, is made with sustainably sourced or ethically sourced, or even not made using child labor or other deleterious production processes, then maybe they'd be more willing to buy that. But there's a lot of questions around could or how that would work. And what I wanted to do with that specific article was very actually, it's a continuation of a theme that I explore in the
Hmm.
book, is around this idea of choice. And I think what consumers demand is from manufacturers is a choice out there, and it's sort of related. But I'll bring up fair trade coffee, for instance, and I'll grant you that
Okay.
buying an
Yeah,
EV
yeah.
is not the same as a cup of coffee, but the coffee industry was really shaken by the demand for a fair trade coffee by the fair trade coffee movement. Call it about 10 or 15 years
Hmm.
ago. Starbucks especially was really rocked by this. How much does Starbucks pay coffee farmers in Ethiopia? Does it help them with sustainable farming practices? What does it look like to have a long-term relationship with those farmers? And so that was a demand by Starbucks's customers to have better relationships with its farming communities. And that had a huge benefit for how coffee is produced. And again, I'll grant you, an electric vehicle is not a coffee bean, but I think that does lay bare the power that consumers do have to advocate for better practices in how the products they use every day are produced.
And and there's also policy and also NGOs that were involved
Yes.
in that demand. I mean, I had a
Yep.
friend that used to work at the Wilson Center, who did a study on the citizen science, going out to the coffee fields in Latin America, and giving them the power to like monitor and report and to create transparency, which you've already said, and it's very clear throughout the book. The whole critical mineral supply chain, it's not transparent. Oh, before I
Unfortunately.
forget, reminding the participants that there is a Q&A box. I saw that someone, Rachel, you raised your hand. Can you just go put your question in the Q&A in the question box and then we can answer it? Yeah, sorry, just continue. Anything else you want to say about the pricing question? Because I mean, it would be, there's a lot of motivation to solve this.
Yeah, I think so there's two fronts here. I would say there are exchanges like the London Metal Exchange and others that are trying to figure out how they would be able to do this. And then there are governments that are saying what levers could governments take via tariffs and other steps. We've got a election in the United States coming up here in what, just
Hmm.
about 2 weeks. You might not have been aware, Jennifer. I
I was
just
totally not aware. No.
and so I do think the tariff question, for better or worse, will not be answered at least in the next 2 weeks. But we do know that certain exchanges are looking at this. What would be interesting is that if they're not able to figure this out, if we start to see more party to party transactions between mining companies and automakers, for instance,
Hmm.
to set security of supply at a specific price. So, for instance, there's a graphite producer in Quebec that has signed a deal with General Motors, and General Motors wants guaranteed North American supply of graphite. Not to nerd out on you too much, but an electric vehicle battery, the volume of graphite is actually the largest by volume, the weight in a
Hmm.
battery. So you need a lot of graphite, basically. And so for General Motors, having a regional supply that's secure, that's likely not going to be affected by weather or armed conflict, is a huge appeal. Now they are paying a premium for that graphite in this example, and
Hmm.
that's obviously their decision as a business, but that's going direct to direct. So what could that mean long term for exchanges, which by design are partly aiming at price transparency? Excuse me. So there's huge implications for how metals are priced moving forward. That's a little nerdy and wonky, I'll grant you, but it does kind of give you an idea of where things could go in the next 5, 10, 15 years.
I work at a policy think tank. We we
Fair.
we we live in nerdiness and
Come on
geekiness.
in. The water's
Come on,
warm.
yeah, woo! It's a great place. Well, so speaking of the tariffs, I mean, we now have the U.S. Biden Harris administration put 100% tariff on Chinese EVs. The Europeans are talking the same. Is this just a band-aid?
Well, I'm curious what the workarounds could be moving forward. I mean, we did see a lot of consternation when Ford announced its CATL plants in Michigan, I believe it was. And actually, that's actually part of the book, and you get to, I'll tease the audience in saying that you'll get to figure out why towards the back half of the book there. But could Chinese companies look to partner with American automakers and operate in the mainland United States and get around those tariffs? I mean, we'll see. It would be interesting. We do know that the U.S. automakers, I'll put, I'll say the legacy U.S. automakers. I won't include Tesla in this analogy, but they are struggling to make a profit on electric vehicles. Ford loses, I think it's what, more than $10,000 or $15,000 at least for every electric vehicle it produces right now. The profit margins on electric vehicles are razor thin. I should say, as an aside, the profit margins on producing critical minerals for electric vehicles are near double digits. So you can sort of see, the price transparency, excuse me, the price difference there. And the um, ability for tariffs in the long term to hold back an industry. I mean, I think we're just going to have to wait and see there. I mean, having 100% tariff on a product does obviously keep it out of the country, but we do know that there is a huge range and diversity of electric vehicles in mainland China right now, and they're becoming increasingly common. As you were just saying, and Jennifer, I mean, your
Mhm.
example from your visit earlier this year is just sort of one data point that shows how ubiquitous they are there in mainland China. And what that could mean for the future of the electric vehicle in the US, I don't know. I mean, I think for better or worse, the electric vehicles in the US has been politicized. Um, in a way that perhaps looks past what some people see as the many benefits of them. And as we were saying earlier, this is also about so much more than just electric vehicles.
Yep. All right, we got the questions are starting to pour in, so let's do some kind of rapid fire answers. Does that sound good?
Sure.
There's Nicole Puy. She said, I work in congressional education and have assembled a critical minerals 101 issue brief. What would you say is the most important for congressional offices to know when it comes to critical mineral supply chains and recycling?
Hey, Nicole, thanks for the question. One of the things I talk about in the book that I think should be more for your constituents, especially to talk about, and therefore you and your offices, is the 1872 mining law. This is a law that has governed hard rock mining in the United States since Ulysses S. Grant was president. He signed it into law in the years after the Civil War. Now, I wasn't around, Jennifer wasn't around, but we can both promise you that President Grant did not know what an automobile was. He did not know what a camera was. The law is just written for a different time. And so as a result, you've got some perks built into it that were designed to populate the US West that I would say, I've been to California recently. Jennifer and I were on a panel there earlier this year. There's a lot of
Yeah,
people in the US West.
yeah.
But the law also means that if you're a mining company and you extract critical minerals off of federal land, you're not paying the taxpayer any royalties. Now, that's a perk that oil and gas companies would kill for, I promise you.
Okay. Another question from Steve Myers. Currently, the U.S. Department of Defense is funding mining companies to compete no, to complete environmental impact statements for critical mineral projects. To your knowledge, have there been any other similar programs in the US where one federal agency provides funding to private companies to help them meet the regulatory requirements of another federal agency?
Thanks for your question, Steve. I think what you're referring to is the Perpetua project in Idaho, which is an antimony project, which the Pentagon has helped fund some of the permitting and other costs related to that project to get its licenses to operate. The Pentagon really, really needs antimony, and it's used as a flame retardant to make bullets and other weaponry. And I spent time in Idaho visiting that site. So just a tease for that chapter here. Off the top of my head, I'd have to get back to you on that. I would say that I it would not surprise me if there are many, many other examples of one federal agency helping a private company to move forward in a regulatory process involving another agency. But because I think one of the things that I found and do explore in the book is sometimes that one hand in the federal government bureaucracy doesn't really know what the other hand is doing, and they often are in their own silos and have their own congressionally mandated aims that they're after. And sometimes those can seem at odds. And so the flower analogy that Jennifer and I were alluding to earlier, you get to see firsthand during the course of the narrative that dynamic at play.
Okay, great. Will Sawyer asks, I think kind of touch on this. Does the world have enough lithium and other critical minerals for everyone to make the green transition?
I would say yes. And I think we were talking about recycling earlier. You know, the beauty of this is that we can reuse old devices over and over again. At some point, we're going to get to the idea where we're going to get to the point where we won't need to dig another mine and get to the point of what's known as a circular economy. Now, anybody that tells you know what they know when that will be, I think they're just throwing spaghetti against the wall. But at some point, we will hit this idea of a truly circular economy where we just reuse old devices and repurpose them for new devices again and again and again. When that will be, I don't know. But I will say that mining companies, especially, know that this will be a reality one day. I have a CEO quoted in the book of a major lithium company that acknowledges as much to me as we're talking. And that's why I think recycling is such a key part of this conversation. We've got to make it a bigger muscle that people are exercising and using more and more.
One of our former fellows and soon to be global fellow, Steve Jackson, he said, is it worth noting that China is the dominant antimony producer in the world? I mean,
Yes, and I will say it has been for more than 100 years. I mean, World War II. You know, we could sort of debate forever. You know, sort of the genesis of the war in the Pacific on that, but you know, it was in part linked to antimony and sort of Japan's desire to get access to some of that antimony supply there, and that this was a huge concern for the United States during World War II as well. And so I will say with antimony, it's not necessarily a recent, i.e., past 20, 30, 40 years development that China has countered this industry. It actually has controlled it for the better part of 100 years right now. And if you're the Pentagon and you're tasked with building a lot of these critical pieces of weaponry, and you have to keep them maintained. Obviously, an antimony supply is huge for you, as are rare earths. We were talking about rare earths earlier. You can't have an you can't have an F-35 fighter jet without rare earths. Or you can't have a submarine without rare earths. So you can obviously see why the Pentagon is keen on better supply, better regional supply of those.
but definitely, I mean, upshot we see everywhere is that in the near term, we are still going to be dependent on Chinese refined.
The short
Yeah,
answer is yes. Yep.
yeah. I mean, just like
Um,
we can't break free from that anytime in the near future, right?
that's true, and I think that part of the reason why there's concern, if there is some kind of conflict, whatever that could be, what would it look like to have those supply chains cut off? And I have this a story in the book in 2010 when China did cut off exports to Japan. It was after a fishing incident between two trawlers. So not necessarily, you know, anything high stakes, but that led to a diplomatic dispute that led to the blocking of exports there. So you can imagine if there's something a little more serious than a trawler dispute, what could that look like?
Yeah. And Daniel Hicks, you read my mind, Daniel. I had it right here as my next question. He says, as opposed to couching everything in strategic competition, do you see opportunities for cooperation with the PRC? So, I mean, do you see paths forward? Because
Well, I mean, I think so too. To answer to that, I would say it starts with greater understanding and greater dialogue around these issues, and I'm really so thankful that the war below is sparking these conversations. I also think that the reality is that you know many American companies and Western companies are huge supporters of these supply chains in China right now. Albemarle, the world's largest lithium producer and processor, has multiple facilities in mainland China to process lithium and to supply that EV industry. And it's a very successful industry for them. You have Apple, obviously, huge producer there, many other companies as well. So that cross border collaboration is there. And I think obviously helps GDP, obviously helps trade, et cetera, et cetera. So I think the more that you have that, it helps sort of reinforce the relationship between the two countries. But I don't necessarily, and I'm not advocating in the book that there is a conflict that's going, that there's a cold conflict now that could lead to something greater. What I'm actually saying is that, I mean, having more regional supply and increasing more regional supply is perhaps a better way to think about these issues rather than sort of just taking back what might be in another country right now.
Mhm. And not to go, we don't have time to do the whole thing, but we got a question from Janet Larson about asking about deep seabed mining. This is something that a question she turned in ahead of time.
Sure.
Because there's a lot of debate about, is this the new battleground? Is this your second book? No.
Well, so just as a quick framer for the audience, so deep sea mining, there's three main types of deep sea mining, but what I think Jen is referring to is the Clarion Clipperton Zone, which is sort of south of Hawaii and west of Mexico, and it's this big plain that's about a mile or two under the surface of the water that contains, thousands, hundreds of thousands of little nodules, and it's very unclear how these nodules developed or what the time frame of them are. But what we do know is they're extremely metals rich, especially in manganese, nickel, and other critical minerals. And you pick them up, you throw them into a smelter, and boom, you get the metals. You have very little waste. You are not digging a giant hole in the ground. There's nobody living next door that might have concerns on indigenous or religious rights reasons. So it ticks many boxes. But what many conservation and environmental groups are saying is because we don't know the exact genesis of these rocks, these nodules, because we don't know what role they play in the ecology of the ocean floor, then it needs to be studied more. And the machines that they would use, the industry would use to pick up these nodules are essentially giant vacuums. And so there's also concerns around what could the effect that the what effect would it have to basically vacuum up the ocean floor? Would that affect whales? Would that affect other ocean life? And the environmental and conservation community is saying we need to have more studies. This is in international waters. So the United Nations Law of the Sea is the governing body here. There's an organization out of Kingston, Jamaica, that has been debating back and forth for years what the rules should be. They're getting pretty close to that. The United States, I should say, did not sign the law of the sea, so it is not part of this conversation
Exactly.
right now, and does not therefore have a seat at the table. And that's a long-winded way of saying that at some point somebody will start deep sea mining in earnest, and how that actually moves forward is going to be really interesting because at the end of the day, there's very little enforcement mechanism. So you could have a company just go down there and just start doing it, and there's no way to stop them or regulate them. And so then it gets back to the consumer. If somebody is taking polymetallic nodules off the ocean floor and selling them to a manufacturer, and they're making a product that you're buying, are you in favor of that? I think these are things for us to be debating.
Exactly. And the fact that the US is not at the table
Yep.
and that we're having so much difficulty. I mean, as your book goes through, more time you have in the back that talks about how it is so just the regulation of this. But it does, really boil down to it's like, it's about again something topic that's not very sexy to most people, industrial strategy, right? And the
Indeed.
Chinese are just, they're, you know, yeah, so I think we're just down to the last 2 minutes. There's
Sure.
a few other questions. Some of them that seem to be questions that you kind of covered. Well, one was the last one here. Jonas asked about the work conditions on mines. I mean, there's run that they're running the Chinese own, but other countries. Is there is there any effective regulation of this?
Well, I think it depends on what country you're in, certainly, and I think what Joanna is referencing there is likely artisanal mining, and
Hmm.
this is a practice. basically where average people can either break onto mine sites or dig near mine sites. And you see it a lot in the DRC, Zambia, and other African countries. Sometimes, unfortunately, you can have children as young as 6 or 7 that
Mhm.
are basically taking pickaxe and shovel and digging rock out of the ground, and then they'll sell it to a processing network, maybe somebody with a truck bed, and who'll pay a few bucks for the rock that they take, and then that truck will deliver it to a processing facility, and then it will go into the global supply chain for these critical minerals, and it could be nearly impossible to track the provenance. And so, in that example, you can have these young children get injured or even killed in some extreme examples, and this obviously is, you know, not right. I think we can all agree that we do not want child labor being part of our
Yeah.
critical mineral supply chain. But it can be very hard to police the provenance of those critical minerals and also to enforce safety standards. And so there are efforts by some international mining companies to stop it or abrogate it if you work in the DRC, for instance. But I do have a chapter in the book that talks about how an American company was one of the largest cobalt producers in the DRC, but unfortunately, due to some ill-timed investments in other sectors, had to actually sell that facility to a Chinese company, and that has led to the rise of artisanal mining in
Mhm.
these facilities there. So you get to track that during the chapter as well. And I was very thankful that several executives from that company took time to share their perspectives on it, and also their regret on having to sell that asset
Mhm.
in what is now the world's largest cobalt facility. So
Mhm.
standards, to answer your question, Joanna, depend obviously by country, but for me, it does get back to us as consumers and policymakers and others speaking with louder voices on this. So we've got companies like Microsoft, for instance, that are taking this issue extremely seriously and want to do as much as they can to ensure that the materials that they're buying were not produced with child labor or at low ESG standards.
Yeah. Well, great. So we've hit the time. So good. And again, he didn't give away everything. You guys got to get this book. And I think that, we'll have to have you back. And I know that a lot of your colleagues across the world in Reuters have been doing some reporting on this, and we're hoping to
Yes.
tap them down the road too. But thank you so much. And again, congrats on your book. And thank you for the great questions that all of you gave. And this webinar, we'll be trying to post it online later today. So thanks so much.
Hey, great to be with you all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
This video was produced by the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. If you'd like to see more, please like, comment, and subscribe to our channel. There you'll find in-depth discussions and research on important global issues and topics. And thanks for watching.